In the last video, we talked about sampling rate, how to determine an appropriate sampling rate to represent audio digitally. And that had to do with the x-axis, the time axis of our waveform representation. In this video, we're going to turn to the y-axis, the amplitude axis, and talk about how many binary digits, what our bit width needs to be to represent each amplitude sample that we record. So we'll talk more formally about what bit width is, and we'll review what binary numbers are in case you're not familiar with them already. And then we'll also talk about some implications of bit width in terms of how we record sound and also how artists have used it in some interesting ways. So formally, the bit width is the number of binary digits that we use to represent the amplitude of each sample. So for each of these dots here, how many binary numbers are we using on the computer? How many zeros or ones, digits, are we using to represent what that amplitude value is? So it's important that we think about this in terms of binary numbers. So if we had a bit width of 1, for example, that would mean we'd use one binary digit. And a binary digit can either be 0 or it can be 1. It's either on or it's off. So we have two possibilities here. It's either 0 or it's 1. So that means that our resolution is effectively 2. We have two options for how we're going to represent the amplitude. That would obviously be an incredibly restrictive environment to work in. So if we went up to 2 bits, each one of them, each of these two binary digits could be either 0 or 1. So we have two possibilities for the first digit, two possibilities for the second digit. 2 times 2 is 4. Still pretty limited. If we went up to 8 bits, which is something that's actually used in some fairly low resolution recordings, we have 8 binary digits. We have 2 to the 8th power possibilities, 256 possible amplitude values. So in other words, as we're taking the -1 to +1 amplitude space, that y-axis of our waveform, we kind of limit it to 256 different possibilities evenly spread across that space. 16 bits, which is what we use in CDs, we have 2 to the 16th possibilities, about 65,000. And then 24 bits, which is what I like to use whenever possible, we have 2 to the 24th possibilities, so 16 million. So those extra 8 bits from 16 bit to 24 bits gets you a lot of extra resolution on your y-axis, from 65,000 up to about 16 million. Some people record in 32-bit as well with some high-end audio software and hardware. Obviously, we want to record with as much resolution as we can within the limits of whatever media we're working with. Obviously, we're eventually using a CD. We're going to be limited to 16 bits when we finally encode that file for a CD. And we can't use infinite amounts of disk space, an issue we'll get to a couple of videos hence. But I also just want to talk about the implications of this for recording. Because it's not enough just to record something at a good bit width, using 16 bits or 24 bits or 32 bits or whatever. It's very important that when you're recording, you try to use the full dynamic range that's available to you. Because if you're recording at a high bit width, but you're only using a tiny bit of the -1 to +1 amplitude range, because your mic levels are turned really low or whatever else might be going on in your process, you're wasting all these bits. They're just never getting used for anything. And so you're effectively recording at a much lower resolution. But on the other hand, if you record too loud, you're like, I wouldn't use every single one of those bits no matter what. That's also a problem, because if you go over the -1 to +1 range, well then you run out of binary digits to represent those amplitude values, and so they all just kind of get clipped or cut off at +1 or -1, and so you end up with something called digital distortion. Which is also not a good thing, because basically the peaks and the troughs of all your waveforms just get kind of lopped off. And that tends not to sound very good either. I want to give you a sense of all of this for a minute. So I want to look at this in practice in Reaper now. And what I have open here is just a 440 hertz sine wave on my track. And then I have a plugin here that's going to let me dynamically change the bit width of my sound. And then we have an oscilloscope over here so that I can monitor the waveform and see how the waveform is changing visually. So I'll go ahead and start playing my sine wave. So this is a full bit width. This actually says 32 bits, but it was recorded at 24 bits, so it's really 24 bits right now. But you can see you get a very good shape on the curves of the sine wave. As I bring this down, you'll start to see, it's almost like an image getting pixelated. You'll start to see the individual amplitude values in the bit width start to emerge, and you'll start to hear the sound changing and its timbre changing is it's not able to represent the fullness of that curve anymore. You can see it's starting to flatten off at the top and the bottom. You can start to see some kind of pixelation in the middle as we're lowering and lowering the bit width. And the further I go, it actually starts to look and sound more and more like a square wave. And now we can see that we're at about 2 bits, and there's really just 4 distinct amplitude values that are possible: the -1 and +1, and then these two values in between. If I go to a real-world sound, like the same drum sample we were looking at in the last video, you can see a similar effect. So we'll look at this on the oscilloscope as well, and I'll again gradually reduce the bit depth. You can see something else is happening too, though. So the sound is getting very different timbrely. It's also getting incredibly noisy. Because as we get fewer and fewer amplitude values, and we're recording real world sounds here, we start losing out on things to represent very soft things. And so a bunch of things that are very close to 0 are getting rounded up, actually, and are starting to make some noise in our mix. So when you record at low bit widths, you also tend to get a lot more noise in your sound because of this averaging out that needs to happen. What I want to show you now is what I was talking about in terms of these implications for recording. Before I started recording this video here for you, I went and I recorded a sound that was on purpose recorded very, very, very quietly. So that you may not even be able to hear this. That's how quietly it was. So I recorded it at a reasonable bit width, 24 bits, but by the time I have to increase the gain on this, it's very noisy. Because I've increased the gain not just of what I wanted to record, but I've also increased the gain of all the stuff that I didn't want, all the background noise and things. And I'm using a much lower resolution than 24-bit for all this, because I'm just using this tiny space here, just this tiny space here, just this tiny space here, rather than the full -1 to +1 range. If I go the other direction, though, I can get myself in just as much trouble. So here's a sound that's recorded way too loud.
This is too loud.
And you can hear that distortion. It just doesn't sound like it's coming out quite right. And even if I were to turn down the volume on this, that distortion wouldn't go away.
This is too loud.
You can hear that it's still there. And the reason has to do, if you look at the waveform here, that when it gets too loud, I'm losing the peaks and troughs of my waves. They're just flattening out there because I've run out of binary digits to represent them as I move beyond the +1 and -1 range. So that's something else to be very wary of. Let's go back to our slide stack here. And there's one more thing I want to talk about here, which is the implications of a bit width in music over the years. Early video game consoles, and in particular, were very limited in their bit width. And so they inspired a particular kind of music. And if you think about video games from the 80s and even the early 90s, you can imagine the kinds of sounds that I'm thinking of. This is something that a lot of musicians have exploited more recently through, I suppose, a bit of nostalgia. There's a chiptunes movement where people deliberately compose sounds using limited bit widths in order to recreate some of those timbres of video games of days long past. There's also musicians that use it for other reasons. So I wanted to highlight a composer who lives in New York named Tristan Parrish. He's done a number of albums where he deliberately has sounds, all of his audio is generated with just 1 bit. So that extreme simplicity of either the amplitude is on or off, and there's nothing in between. And one of the reasons he does this is that he actually wants to package his music in an interesting way. What you see in this picture here is actually the CD that you buy of one of his albums, 1-Bit Symphony. It's a CD case. There's no CD inside. Instead, what you have inside of it here is you have a battery, you have a button to skip tracks, you have a volume knob, you have a headphone jack, and then you have these chips that actually contain the logic for the code that actually generates all the music. And so there's this extreme simplicity of how he's generating this. In order to deliver this to you in a very kind of strange format, you plug your headphones into the CD case and start pushing the buttons in order to listen to the music. But working within these restrictions is also something that I think Tristan finds very appealing compositionally for him. By only being able to work with one-bit sounds and this very limited set of timbres, it's actually inspired him to be creative in new ways. So I'd like you to go ahead and listen to a track from his first one-bit album called A Certain Movement. Okay, to review, in this video we've talked about bit width, what it means in terms of binary digits. And we also talked about its implications in terms of when we record sound, wanting to take advantage of our bit width, but not go beyond the binary digits that are available to us. And ways that some musicians have taken advantage of limited bit widths for artistic use. In the next video, we'll address the question of how many channels we need to record sound in different scenarios to represent the location of sounds in space.